Magnus Carlsen seems to be unfazed with all the stuff going around with him and Hans Niemann, and just with a clear mind is playing some of the best chess in his career. The game we're going to look at today is a rapid game between himself and Nils Grandelius from the Aimchess Rapid Knockout Tournament. Magnus has white, Grandelius has black. Let's jump right in. Magnus begins with b3, or the Larsen's opening. d5, bishop to b2, c5. One of the ideas for white is to control the e5 square, but also this opening is very transpositional and can turn into other openings. e3, knight to f6, knight to f3, continuing to control e5. And now g6. Grandelius wants to challenge this bishop at b2. And here's c4. Another option is bishop to b5 check, playing it like a Bogo Indian in reverse. But with c4, he's turning it into sort of a ready style opening, but he already has complete control over the d4 square. And what that means is that black cannot play d4 himself and gain space in the middle of the board, which is black's best approach when playing the ready. So he's basically taken away black's best option from him. So Grandelius takes the pawn on c4, and Carlsen takes with the bishop. And you see, these bishops are sweeping. They're pretty strong here. Bishop to g7, castles, castles, and now d4, getting a presence in the center. Pawn takes, and he takes with the knight. He doesn't want to take with the pawn and create a weakness. I mean, this is probably technically playable, but Magnus does not like creating weaknesses in his positions voluntarily, so he takes with the knight. a6 keeps a piece out of b5, but also can expand with b5 himself, hitting that bishop on c4, knight to d2, and that's exactly what Nils Grandelius does. He plays b5, he hits the bishop at c4, which has to reroute. So Magnus moves it to e2 so that it can be placed on this very nice long diagonal, which black, of course, places his bishop there first. But now bishop to f3 challenges that bishop, and white would be fine with exchanging those bishops. So what Nils Grandelius does is he plays knight to d5. And what that does is it prevents the exchange of bishops and sort of keeps this bishop on f3. The bishop doesn't want to take the knight. That would be a mistake. He'd give up the two bishops, and black would have undisputed control of the light square diagonal. But now with the bishop on f3, it allows black to play e5, e4, hitting Magnus's bishop at f3 with tempo. So knight to d5 is a pretty diabolical idea. And here Magnus plays novelty, rook to c1, and the only other game to reach this position, knight to e4, was played. But rook to c1, and now the process, e5. This keeps this knight from developing on c6. But white plays e5. First he hits the knight with tempo, gaining space. The knight moves to c2, and now e4, hitting the bishop on f3 with tempo, and also opening up this diagonal so these bishops are opposite each other. And white has to take the bishop on g7, otherwise he would just lose his bishop on b2. So bishop g7, and now pawn takes bishop. If he plays king takes bishop, then just knight takes pawn, and in that case, white would be winning. He just grabbed the pawn. So black can't just take the bishop back. He's got to take on f3, but that was Nils Grandelius's plan from the very beginning anyway. Now, Magnus retreats the bishop back to b2. Well, what happens if he just continues on, right, and takes the rook? And that seems like a reasonable idea. That would be a terrible blunder, because then knight to c3. The knight hits the queen, and the only square the queen can move to where it won't be captured is e1, and then knight to e2, check. And if the queen doesn't take the knight, the only other legal move is king to h1, and then pawn takes checkmate. So bishop takes rook is a really bad blunder. So he retreats the bishop to b2, but now pawn takes, hitting the rook, and he can't take that pawn with the king, because then knight e3 with a discovered check, you hit the queen, and actually it's even worse than that. You could quickly get mated. So there's no way he can do that. So he moves the rook, Carlsen does, to e1. Now knight to d7, activating the knight. The knight can go to e5, maybe threaten f3. Knight to e4, queen to e7, threatens the knight on e4. So here Carlsen plays queen to d4. Now he's threatening mate on g7, or h8 for that matter. So Nils Grandelius plays f6, and that blocks the queen from delivering mate, but you'll notice it opens up these light squares. They get a little vulnerable. The king is a little loose. Bishop to a3. Looks like it's skewering the queen and the rook, but black can block it with b4, at least temporarily. Then knight takes b4. Knight takes b4. So for the moment, black is up a piece, but this knight is pinned to the queen, and white has very active pieces. So what Carlsen does is play rook to c7. Now that is a double attack on the knight and the bishop. There are a couple of convenient ways to get out of that. First, he could just take the knight on e4. That would be equal. And also bishop to c6 works fairly well. It's kind of complicated, but the knight defends the bishop. If rook takes, bishop, knight takes, he can take the queen, but then the knight can take that queen. It's just a back and forth. That's not what he does. Nils Grandelius plays the move queen to e6. He gets out of the pin both of the rook and of the bishop at a3, and rook takes b7. Now material equality for the moment has been restored, and black plays the move knight to e5, which with a very dangerous threat of knight to f3 check, which would fork the king. See that knight here? The king and the queen would be forked by a knight on f3. So Carlsen has to do something about that, and what he does is he takes the knight. Queen takes b4. Now knight f3 check, king to g2, which is forced. Knight to e1 also with check, and the king goes to g3. So in this wild position, black has a couple of reasonable options. One move he can play is rook a to e8, which threatens to take the knight at e4. He could also move his knight to d3 and attack the queen at b4. What he does instead is he plays queen to f5. Now, this is a pretty nasty move. It has the threat of queen to f3 check, king h4, knight to g2 checkmate. So queen f5 is a nasty threat. As it turns out, as threatening as this move looks, it is a blunder. It is a mistake. And the reason is, after the move f4, which was played in the game, now this queen on b4 has access to the e7 square, and the rook and the queen together would threaten mate on g7 or h7, and the queen at f5 no longer defends that square. So Grandelius plays rook a to e8, so the rook is defending it. So shouldn't that be enough? Well, no, because Carlsen plays queen to c4 check. Remember earlier when we talked about this move f6, loosening this diagonal? Well, now here's the price that is paid for that. Queen to c4 check, and if the queen blocks, let's say, then bishop takes rook, queen c4, knight f6 check, and after a few checks, and then he takes the queen on c4, and this game is totally winning. White is up 3 pawns and dominates black's king, so black wouldn't want to allow that. So he plays the king to h8, but now because the queen checked, bishop f8, and after the rook takes, queen to c7. And the threat of mate at either g7 or h7 is completely unstoppable. And Magnus wins another game at the Aimchess Rapid. I hope you enjoyed the game. If you want to see another great game from Magnus Carlsen, be sure to click on this video. I think you're going to enjoy it. See you later.